In the office with me was Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. And I was at the time with Alan Weisselberg. The bottom signature, I believe, is Alan Weisselberg's. Alan Weisselberg, Alan Weisselberg, Alan Weisselberg. That's signed by Alan Weisselberg, always Alan Weisselberg on the check.
Are there other people that we should be meeting with?
So, Alan Weisselberg.
Chuck Rosenberg, Kaiser Sosa of the Cohen hearings, of the perhaps investigations out of SDNY. Why is Alan Weisselberg, who my understanding had some narrow, limited immunity around certain questions, but is not a cooperating witness, will he become one, and why is he so important?
Well, he's important, Nicole, because he's been around the Trump Organization and Mr. Trump for a long time. These are the types of people who are important witnesses because they see stuff, they read stuff, they hear stuff. They've just hang around. So Weisselberg couldn't be having a good day yesterday. He's probably not having a particularly good day today either. And I imagine, well, I should say there's a problem with him testifying before Congress, which is that he very well may have a Fifth Amendment issue, meaning that a truthful answer to questions may tend to incriminate him. He would only want to testify with immunity. And this gets a little complicated, and I won't go too deep into it. But if Congress wants to hear from him and they immunize him in order to get his testimony, that could make it tough on prosecutors down the road. I'm guessing prosecutors will go first. They'll get everything that they need and want from Mr. Weisselberg, and maybe only then will Congress hear from him.
Chuck, can you just explain what sorts of crimes he would have witnessed? I mean, he was talking in the context for at least some of those questions of the hush money scheme that we know the Southern District of New York found to be a criminal undertaking on Cohen's part. They also referenced individual one, the president. What would Weisselberg's role have been? What crimes would he have witnessed? What crimes could he have committed himself?
Yeah, three come to mind. The first is the hush money payments. If he helped facilitate those payments and knew that the purpose was to conceal from Federal Election Commission officials, from the American public, the purpose of those payments, and it was their goal to influence the election, sure, he could have criminal liability for that. But two other things come to mind. As the money guy, as the CFO of the Trump Organization, if he helped Trump prepare false financial statements that were submitted to banks to get loans, or if he devalued assets for purposes of tax reporting, that could give rise to liability, either for financial fraud, bank fraud, and the like, or for tax fraud. Now, again, I want to be very careful here. I don't know Mr. Weisselberg, although I heard his name a lot yesterday. But that all depends on what he knew, not simply whether he was used as a pawn, perhaps, to create inflated financial statements, but whether he knew that in so doing, he was helping someone else commit a fraud. That intent piece is really important.
Well, I mean, let me just, from a layman's perspective, if he saw that inflated wealth or inflated assets on a loan application or on the Forbes 100 list, wouldn't it be obvious that the fraud was being publicized and used?
Well, if he knew it was wrong, right? If he knew what the real numbers were and he let the fake numbers go forth and he let them go to a bank, for instance, to help obtain a loan, absolutely, he's in the soup. If he's just being used, for instance, Nicole, if you wanted to cheat on your taxes and you concealed from your tax preparer the fact that you had a foreign bank account, she would not have criminal liability because you didn't tell her the truth. If she knew you had a foreign bank account and she helped you conceal it, then she would. So it will turn on what Mr. Weisselberg knew. Because he's been so deep in that organization for so many years, I suspect he knows quite a bit.
Frank Figliuzzi, I want to ask you about some of the other people the governor mentioned, the president's kids. Michael Cohen testified that he briefed the family members about negotiations around Trump Tower Moscow. We talked about how that's likely a subject today in front of the House Intel Committee. One of the sort of known lies that's out there is that Michael Cohen, he's now confessed to and pleaded guilty to lying to Congress about the time period around Trump Tower Moscow. The president certainly lied to the public. We don't know what he said. Rudy Giuliani seems to suggest that the written responses gave the president through Election Day to have been having those conversations with the Russians. But where do you think the other pressure points are for the other individuals the governor mentioned, the president's kids and other people at Trump Organization?
I found it interesting, Nicole, that Robert Mueller's been essentially hands-off with the kids, with the family members. And so My imagination runs wild about whether or not that kind of hands-off approach has been done in coordination with the Southern District or other districts, because maybe the Southern District is going to handle that, and that's where I think this is going. We're also headed for quite a show if indeed Congress and various committees start slapping family members with subpoenas. But Don Jr. is at the top of the family list as someone who is totally exposed criminally. Jared Kushner has issues that are likely beyond the remit of Bob Mueller, and I think this is going to be a pressure point, as it has been in even garden variety public corruption cases that I've been experienced with, where you start getting that official worried about exposure of his family, and you start entering into negotiations based on whether or not family members are criminally exposed, and then you start learning about whether or not that official really is a loving family man or whether he's got only his self-interest at heart. We may be headed to a point where we see what Trump is made of in terms of those kinds of decisions.
Let me play in that vein for two people who know the family what Michael Cohen said the president thinks of his son, Donald Trump Jr.
Mr. Trump had frequently told me and others that his son, Don Jr., had the worst judgment of anyone in the world. And also that Don Jr. would never set up any meeting of significance alone, and certainly not without checking with his father.
You agree with that testimony?
Listen, I don't agree that he would not do a meeting without getting his father's permission. That's not my experience.
The
with them.
Russians to get dirt on Hillary?
Well, let's assume that you agree that he has bad judgment. Then, yeah, I think that just reinforces the idea that he might do something like that without talking to his father first, because only someone with bad judgment would do that. And listen, everybody who was in that meeting had bad judgment. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., and Paul Manafort all had bad judgment. They didn't run it by the lawyers first. They didn't run it by Don McGahn. They didn't seemingly talk to anybody else about it. And to be in that room was awful judgment. So we do have some stark evidence of really bad judgment on all three of them.
Do you believe Cohen's raising the possibility that the president was aware of that meeting?
Well, the president said he wasn't.
You believe him?
Do I believe him? Listen, I'm going to believe him until I have a reason not to.
Well, he's told 9,576
I understand
lies.
that, but I evaluate each statement.
You waiting for 10,000?
I evaluate each statement on its merits.
All 10,000 of them.
Well, whichever. I don't think I've reviewed all 10,000.
You know this president as a parent. You guys talk about raising kids together. Did he think his son was smart?
He never said anything negative to me about any of his children. So.
Did he think his son had good judgment?
He never said that to me one way or the other, so I wouldn't know. What he talked to me about, which I detail in the book, is that he was concerned about going to the presidency and no longer being there every day to help guide the business and guide them. And so draw from that whatever you want, but that was the context within which he spoke to me about his concern. How am I going to deal with this if I wind up having this all-consuming job and they're off in New York doing this on their own?
I have heard from sources close to the president that he thought Donald Trump Jr. was an idiot.
Idiot's a strong word, but I will say that in my reporting, it is not my understanding that the president thinks that Don Jr. is his smartest child. That's how I understand how he thinks of Don Jr. And the way
that
in which
is, and that he finds.
Well, Eric is pretty competent and capable too. He's the guy who looks out for his father, who kind of keeps his head down and actually does the work. If you think about who's out publicly doing interviews and on the campaign trail and currently in the White House, there are people who are in it for show, there are people who are in it for their own ambition, and then there's one son who's just back at home doing the work, right?
I agree with Emily on that. I mean, my interaction with Eric Trump over the time, it's made me laugh about Saturday Night Live that portrays Eric as this dimwit. They got it dead wrong. I mean, it may be funny stuff, but it's dead wrong. Eric Trump's a really bright young man and is a hard worker.
Notable that you didn't.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.